Good morning. Today at Shift, I'm excited. We have a great guest with us, Dr. John Haugo. John is a native of Waubun, Minnesota. He's been the CEO of some computer software companies, been a football coach and a math teacher, and is on the board of the Sons of Norway. And that's why we have him here today, about his Norwegian connection. He's 100% Norwegian, but don't turn away because he has a really good story. And he is going to share with us about how the Norwegians helped win the Allied war in World War II. John?
Thank you, John. Yeah, over the last few years, I've gotten particularly interested in my Norwegian heritage. Among other things, we had a 3-day family reunion over in Telemark, where my paternal ancestors came from. Also, we've had a number of trips with Telelag, which is what they call a bygdelag of people whose ancestors came from the Telemark region, or the Telemark county, if you will. And I think one of the common themes of any discussions we had with relatives over there was their experiences during World War II. And that triggered my interest in finding out more about the war, not only from them, but from other sources as well. So what I'd like to do this morning is give a brief overview of the history of World War II and how it affected Norway. I'd like to talk about my Norwegian heritage, specifically my Telemark ancestors. I did have grandparents from farther north in Norway as well. My maternal grandfather is from what's called Hallingdal, and my maternal grandmother is from Sognefjord. I'd like to then talk about the involvement of the Telemark family members in the war. Much of the activity related to the resistance actually appeared in the Telemark district. And the family members that shared their experiences with me are from that region. And then lastly, I'd like to spend probably the most time on the most publicized event of that period, and that was what's known as the Heavy Water War, which occurred in Rjukan, Telemark, at the heavy water plant there. Quick overview then of World War II in Norway. Again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the major happenings. I think one of the questions that always comes up, why was Hitler and the Nazi regime interested in Norway? It was a population of only 3 million. They were a very peace-loving people. They hadn't been in a war for about 100 years. But the thing that interests Hitler the most was the coastline of Norway and the shipping industry associated with that. Because you know, Germany itself does not have a lot of coastline. They were also very interested in iron ore that came across the top at a town called Narvik, because that's where the main source of the iron ore for Germany was brought across. So Hitler was particularly concerned about keeping the port at Narvik open. Well, the invasion of Norway then by the Germans actually started on April 9, 1940. And as shown in the map, they penetrated all along the coast and major coastal towns, and then up the valley, up the gorge to Oslo. So in one fell swoop, they conquered the country. It's the same day that they conquered Denmark, which was another Scandinavian country. Now, coincidentally, the King of the King of Norway and the King of Denmark were brothers. The King of Denmark decided to stay with the country and be a puppet king, if you will. King Haakon didn't want any part of it, so he actually escaped to England, going through the northern port at Hamar. On the map, you can always see the Shetland Islands, which is the group of islands between Scotland and Norway. And this was a common route where fishing boats would take people across from Norway to Shetland Islands and then on to Scotland and eventually into England. Many of the saboteurs then took that route and actually were trained there. During the war, the Germans had approximately 400,000 troops occupying this country of only 3 million. So you can see the density of their population. And although they were expecting the Norwegians to be peace-like and not be very resistant, the reality was that the Norwegians throughout the war had their resistance forces that sabotaged a lot of the Nazi efforts along the way. The royal family, as I mentioned, King Haakon had escaped. He and his son, future King Olaf, and family then actually went to England, and then some of them went on to the United States. The significance of the effort resistance effort in Norway, I think can be exemplified by the speech that President Roosevelt gave in September of 1942. You remember, we had been in the war about a year at that time. I'll read that to you. It's sometimes called the Look to Norway speech. She says, "There's anyone who still wonders why this war is fought, let him look to Norway. If there's anyone who has any delusions that this war could have been averted, let him look to Norway. And if there's anyone who doubts the democratic will to win, again I say, let him look to Norway." So the war in Norway then actually preceded the occupation of countries like France and Belgium and Netherlands, which were occupied several months later. I'm going to be talking about my relatives, so I want to authenticate my Norwegianness. I did like a lot of folks do nowadays, I did an ancestry DNA test, and according to the map, the concentration of my heritage is in lower part of Norway, the yellow area there, and but I'm also less than 1% Irish and less than 1% French. And I'm guessing that goes back to the Viking days, as they had a habit of bringing back some of the young maidens from those occupied countries. So I am a full-blooded Norwegian, as was mentioned earlier. Now, about Telemark. Telemark is in the southeastern section of Norway, as shown on the map. It is one of 20 counties, sometimes called fylkes, although there was some administrative rearranging in January 1st of this year. So I think they've reduced it about 14 counties. And the little county of Vestfold is right next to Telemark. Those are now handled through one administration. And then the small map on the right shows how Telemark itself is divided up into various municipalities. And the main activity that we'll be talking about in the heavy water war would be in the upper section of Tin, and my ancestries would be primarily from Vinji and Toka area of Telemark. More specifically then, my my Telemark grandparents were Tarjei Haugo, who was immigrated first with his family in 1888, and then he went back, furthered his education, and ended up marrying my grandmother in 1895, and then they immigrated on to Iowa. And eventually they moved to northwest Minnesota. Tarjei was a farmer, but he was also trained, as a lot of Norwegians during that era would have a second occupation, and he was a veterinarian, a self-taught veterinarian, sometimes called a horse doctor. He specializes in disease and injuries to horses. His wife then, my grandmother, Ann Shelbrae, actually grew up in a town of Lardall, and I have a picture of the farm there as well as her church, where she was baptized, confirmed, and where she and Tarjei were married in 1895. She had ended up having 12 children, as many immigrant families in those years had large families. My father was number 10. Then on to the experiences of some of my ancestors, in addition to the stories that my grandparents would tell. And by the way, they tried to communicate regularly with my grandmother's sisters. She was one of 6 sisters, and all 5 sisters remained in Norway, and they would send mail back and forth. But I remember seeing as a boy, my grandmother showing one of the letters, and much of it had been blocked out because it had to be reviewed by the Nazi occupation. Okay, the first incident related to the Nazi occupation related to another Tarjei Haugo. And by the way, there's a lot of repetition of first names because you were quite named after the oldest son, named after the grandfather. So then cousins quite often have the same first name. So the different was the middle name. Like my grandfather was Tarjei Torgerson Haugo. This Tarjei Haugo is Tarjei Gunnarsson Haugo. But they were first cousins. Now, Tarjei was a big, powerfully built man, and Hitler, among other things, wanted to promote the super race, the Aryan race. And he felt they typified the pure race of people. And he knew that in Norway they had a lot of big, tall, strong, blonde, blue-eyed men. So he sent up a couple of henchmen up to Norway to find himself a typical Aryan. Well, it so happens that this Tarjei had been married in 1935, and there was a picture in a pharmacy store showing their wedding picture, and the Hitler's henchmen said, "Hey, that really looks like a typical big, strong Aryan." So they had Tarjei pose for a statue and a bust, and that bust was put in the museum in Munich. And on one side of the wall, they had the bust of the Aryan, Tarjei, and across from him, a bust of Hitler. Now, Hitler's seem to have disappeared, but according to Tarjei's daughter, I talked to him a couple of years ago, that bust is still there, and it's called the Aryan. Now, the irony of it is that Tarjei didn't buy into the Nazi thing. He actually was part of the resistance, and I show a picture of some of the resistance troop leaving the mountains at the end of the war. The next experience with of some of my relatives would be 2 of my first cousins, or actually first cousins once removed, they would be of my dad's generation, were Lars Tvedo and Aslak Juvi. And they were from a small community called Lardal. It's a town that my grandmother was born in. You see the picture of the valley. It's a beautiful valley, and there's a small village there and a lot of farms in that area. Now, like most areas of that type in Norway, there would be a few young men would leave to join the resistance. And in that town, there were 8 individuals. You see the picture. This is after they come back in from the mountains. And both Lars and Aslak hid in the mountains for over 4 years. They couldn't contact their family at all, and the Nazis would continue to interrogate. They knew that Lars headed up this contingent from Lardal, but they couldn't find him for those years. Now, the picture shows on their return, the 8 individuals, some of them are carrying Tommy guns, and those were guns that were assault kind of guns that were dropped by parachute from the British that were assisting the resistance fighters. Also, we had conversations with a couple of my cousins, and they shared their experiences with during the war, as young people, they were of my generation. One of them, Steiner Lundeberg, was a retired professor, and he remembered as a boy, he remembers at both his farm and the grandparents' home that the Nazis would continue to interrogate them every week to see what was the situation with Lars, but no one really knew what Lars was, and they didn't tell him. He also tells of an incident where his grandmother had one cow left, and the Nazis ended up taking that cow from his grandmother. And then he remembers that after the war, his dad told them, for years I have been providing food for Lars and Aslak up in the mountains. And what he had done, Steiner's dad had taken these, like cheese and beef, so on, up into an area in the mountains, hidden under a rock, and he'd done that without telling even his wife that he had done that, because if the Germans had known about that, that would have been the end of him. The woman on the right is another cousin, Osney. She's with my pictures with my wife, Sharon. Visited us several years ago. And Osney was the daughter of the local Lutheran pastor. And during the war, since her father could speak German, he was reassigned by the German Nazis to a larger town where he was to teach German to the Norwegian citizens because, of course, by Hitler's plan, we would all be speaking German. She also remembers an incident where she was playing in the front yard with her sister, and a German soldier came by, and he offered her some candy. And Osney was about to eat the candy, and her mother came out of the house and said, "Don't eat it, it could be poison." And she shamed the soldier. Well, I think in retrospect, they feel the soldier had good intents, but there was a fear of the occupation forces. Another connection we have to the occupation is that may have aware Vidkun Quisling had been the defense minister, and he was very sympathetic to the Germans. In fact, he was a traitor. He turned over a lot of secrets to the Germans, and he had actually run for the prime ministership of Germany, of Norway, but lost by a large margin. But he turned over a lot of secrets to Hitler in particular. And after the war then, he was tried and executed by a firing squad. Now, in interest of full disclosure, I should say that Quisling, it turns out, was related to me. We didn't know it. I don't think my grandfather knew it, but I've done a lot of genealogy, and I noticed back in 1773 that the Haugo ancestors had bought a farm from the Quislings. Also noticed that in a few towns away, the Lutheran pastor was Abraham Quisling. And it turns out that was Vidkun's father. And his grandfather had also been a Lutheran pastor. But Vidkun went in to serve in the military, and then, like I say, he became defense minister. Well, he became a traitor. So I got suspicious that probably there's a connection. And unfortunately, there was. And I show on this chart, the website called Genie over in Norway. It's virtually got anyone that ever existed over there. And it shows that Vidkun was my third cousin twice removed. In other words, he was the third cousin of my grandfather, and my father, he would be twice removed, and me 3 times removed. So unfortunately, I had this verified with the folks in Norway, and they said, yes, you are in fact related to the traitor. which was a little hard to swallow, and my wife said, well, it's the way it was, and probably we should disclose that as well. Now, the other side of the coin, speaking of relatives, Joachim Ronneberg, who led one of the sabotage group we'll talk about in a few minutes, was a fourth cousin. By the way, he just passed away a year ago. He headed the sabotage team that blew up the heavy water plant. Okay, on then to the heavy water war and that war. As I mentioned earlier, the Germans were very interested in the hydroelectric power they got here, this being the largest hydro plant in the world, and also produced hydrogen for fertilizer, and in 1933, on an experimental basis, they started to produce heavy water. Now, heavy water production would take presentation by scientists in a long time to explain all the specifics of it, but in general, during the start of the war in 1940, France was experimenting with atomic energy, particularly as related to producing a bomb under Curry. In the United States, Kuppenheimer on the Manhattan Project was working with that, and in Germany, a scientist named Heisenberg was dealing with it. So they were all going. And people in power became concerned. They knew that the atomic bomb had a lot of potential damaging capability, and they knew that if Germany won the race to produce an atomic bomb, it could be disastrous for the rest of the world. So Roosevelt and Churchill, who were leading the Allies, said, we've really got to get on top of this, and they were aware of what's happening, the heavy water plant in Norway. We've got to be doing something about it. So the production of heavy water is an involved process. It actually involves the water run through a cascade of electrolysis cells where the electricity is passed through them, and in doing so, they produce what's called an isotope of hydrogen. Now, if you remember physics at all, an isotope is an atom that has a proton or a neutron added to the core that makes it heavier, thicker, so to speak. And in this case, it took 50 tons of water, which is about 100,000 pounds, to produce 2.2 pounds of heavy water, sometimes called C2O instead of H2O, because of the deuterium. It is physically about 10% heavier than regular water. And then the significance of that is that at that time they're working with atomic energy and splitting the atom, so to speak. And you may have heard of uranium-235 and 238. 238 meant there are 3 more protons added to the nucleus, and in doing so it causes it to be radioactive. Well, if fission is too fast, there isn't enough collision to create a significant explosion. On the other hand, if that can be slowed down some, it is more of an impact, more of an overall explosion. So deuterium was used as a moderator to slow down the process so there would be more collisions, more splitting of the atoms along the way. The World War II, when we dropped the atomic bombs in Japan, we did not use heavy water. We used graphite as the moderator, so to speak. Anyway, as I said, just the discussion of the science of all this gets very specific. And even though I have an undergraduate major in physics, I have to review some of the specifics of this to fully understand it. But anyway, Germany, because of the heavy water being produced at this plant, was very interested in getting that heavy water to them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Churchill and Roosevelt felt that they've got to stop Hitler from gaining his power, because with his evil intent, it caused problems for a lot of the Allies. And so they tried everything. They were aware of what was happening in Norway, being occupied by the Germans, and they tried every attempt they could to destroy that plant in Rjukan. And this then became known as the Heavy Water War, their attempts. And there were 4 attempts that I will highlight briefly here. One in November of 1942 is Operation Grouse and Freshman, it was called. And then the second attempt was Operation Gunnerside in February of 43. And then the third attempt was actually bomb Weimar, the plant, in November of 43, and then actually to sink a ferry boat with some of the heavy water on it. So I'd like to spend a few minutes then on each of those activities. The Operation Freshman Grouse, I don't know where the freshman came from, but the grouse refers to a group of 4 young Norwegians who were trained in sabotage work in England. They were dropped by parachute into an area close to Rjukan, and their goal was to find a location where the British could come in and drop a lot more folks to blow up the plant. So the strategy then was, in this first attempt, was to bring in up as 41, now these are English engineers, and they were going to drop in by parachute, and then they were going to go in as a group to blow up the plant. And the way they did this, they had 2 large Halifax bombers towing a glider across the sea over into the grouse team. In a way, we had grouses because this is an area a lot of people hunted grouse. Were to spot the place where they should land. Unfortunately, that night, it was a bad night that they came over. It was ice storms, and they marked an area. They had flares up where the English engineers should be dropped. They got there. It was too cloudy, so they went back. Now, the first flight, actually, you see the route in the bold line, shows how they came in, were unable to parachute into, so in the way back, the glider got iced up and it broke off, and all of the English were killed. I think there was about 11 engineers killed. The dotted line shows the path of the second Halifax pulling a glider. Again, had a crew of about 5 in the plane and about 11 in the glider. And they didn't even have as good luck as the first one, because both the glider and the plane crashed. Now, there were a few survivors of the crash. I believe there were 6 of them, and the Norwegians tried to hide them, but they couldn't, weren't successful, and those 6 were executed by the Germans. So the first attempt in the heavy water war was a disaster, and it was kind of a thought. The initial thought was, hey, this is going to be too risky to even do anything here. But the second attempt was what they call Operation Gunnerside. Now, those 4 Norwegians that were doing the spotting to start with were still back in the mountains. And they, through radio, were advised then to clear an area, again, locate an area. But this time, rather than bring in a bunch of English engineers, what they would do is bring back some Norwegians who were trained in England, but were familiar with the area. So there were 11 of them in all. And they came in and they successfully landed, parachuted in there with supplies. But they had a long time then to actually go back to the site at Rjukan. Their story, which I'll talk about a little later, was very, very exciting. A lot of things happened along the way, so to speak. And by the way, Gunnerside was a real small village in Norway that they were, and that's why it was called Operation Gunnerside. Now, what those folks did, 11 of them, 2 of them were held back to handle the radios. They had illegal radios back into England. They had to come across to where the heavy water plant was. And I show pictures that I've taken. Now, the main way to get into that from the village below was that bridge. And of course, that was heavily guarded. Another possibility would have been to come around the backside, which would have been a longer route and would have been very exposed. So they actually skied across, and the picture on the right shows the valley they had to go through. They had to go down about 500 feet. And this is a picture I took during the summertime, but they actually came in March when it was still iced up. And they actually were able to get down, the 11 of them, get down and go back up to the right is access to the plant. Now, they were successful. They actually were able to overpower some guards. They were able to go in and plant some explosives and to blow up the machinery that helped make the heavy water. And it actually ended up putting the whole thing out of commission for about 6 months. And fortunately, all of those guys, these Norwegians, being familiar with the area, were able to escape. And about half of them went to 150 miles skied across to Sweden, which you know was neutral at that time, and the other 5 or so scattered into that Telemark area. And there they gave direction to some of the resistance fighters that I talked about with my family, from my family. Okay, so now 6 months later, the Germans had really rebuilt the plant, doing the electrolysis and so on. And Hitler was pretty confident that he was going to be able to get his heavy water for his atomic energy project. But Roosevelt and Churchill in particular were particularly concerned about the ongoing problem there. So they decided to bomb Weimar being the name of the plant. And the Norwegians had advised against it because they felt there's going to be too much collateral damage here. They're just, you drop all these bombs in there. And the little map shows the sites of those bombs. And unfortunately, the plant is tucked into the side of the mountain, and they really didn't damage the plant. But unfortunately, they killed nearly 20 Norwegian citizens. So that effort, like the very first attempt, had been unsuccessful. So the one thing that it did, however, was Hitler and his say, hey, these crazy Norwegians aren't going to let us thrive here. We better take our prize and go home. So they decided to do is take all the heavy water, and the heavy water was in cans or canisters, and there's a small railroad going about 5 miles down to the Lake Tinso, and that lake would eventually get to the ocean, and then they could get the heavy water onto Germany. But through some insiders that worked in the plant, the saboteurs, primarily Knut Auklid, who was one of the original ones, got wind of this. So what they did is went in, they were able to sneak into that ferry boat at night and plant time bombs in there. So when the ferry boat went out to this mountain lake, it was about 1,400 feet deep, the next morning, the explosions went off and the ship was sunk with all of the canisters on it. Coincidentally, about 10 years ago, they were able to go down and find those canisters and found out they still had heavy water. And the pictures I took on the right shows the dock that they left from, and then I also took a picture of a ferry boat like the one that was sunk by them. Okay, so of the 4 attempts at phasing out the plant, 2 of them were successful. Hitler obviously did not progress as fast with the atomic bomb as we did, and the rest is history. Now, because of the significance of this whole episode, and the people that write about the sabotage, etc., that was done in World War II in both Pacific and European theaters, say this is the most successful sabotage that was ever done. And the case can be made that had this not been done successfully, Hitler would have had a lot more power and a lot more longevity. Now, there are, I'd like to end by talking about some of the accounts of this that obviously more detailed and more thorough than what I've been able to cover. But there are 6 accounts of the heavy water war that I have identified. And I'd like to talk about each of them. The first is the Kampanen Tarvanet, which is really a movie made of the actual saboteurs themselves, and that shows continuously at the Weimar site museum today. The second account was the movie made in 1965, The Heroes of Telemark, which some of you may have seen. It's a very popular movie at the side, and it shows Kirk Douglas acting the lead role, and he had this beautiful Norwegian lady with him, which was not true. Norwegian ladies are beautiful, but this one wasn't with him. Anyway, it was Hollywoodized, and it was a very popular movie. And another account that some of you may want to, if you read, is The Skis Against the Atom. Knut Auckland is the guy that put the bomb in, or time bomb, and also was part of the 11. Wrote Skis Against the Atom. It gets very specific on the lives and experiences of the people involved. Then in 2003, British Broadcasting Company did a repeat. They tried to relive the situation of the different episodes, and the real heroes of Telemark. It was this is available actually on YouTube, and they're broken into chapters, but it's very well done. And then in 2015, the Norway had the most popular mini-series ever. They had six 45-minute segments on the heavy water war, and it was very popular. It was available for a while on Netflix, but it's also a very, very thorough experience in getting into the lives and experiences there. And then the last account that I'm somewhat familiar with is The Winter Fortress. It's a book that's just completed in 2016, and the author, Neil Bascom, actually spent 3 years in Norway doing research and also talking to the families of survivors. And coincidentally, he had a book signing at Norway House a couple years ago. I happened to be there, and coincidentally, my cousin from Norway was there, and the cousin had been one of the guides to the saboteurs. So they were very interested in talking about their related experiences. So, Mange tak for listening, and hopefully you found it of interest.
It's a fascinating story, and the work that you have done to connect that story to today and your family is really quite something. Why has it been so important to you to do that?
Well, once you get the genealogy bug, so to speak, you started researching the experiences of your ancestors, and I just got curious because I was able to visit Rupon early on, and some of my, actually would be my first cousin, or second cousin's children were now living in the area, and they were able to. So it hit close to home. And like I say, Rupon is about 25 or 30 miles from the hometown of my grandfather.
Well, it's so interesting too how it's on that cliff. It looks like a fortress.
Yeah.
And for them to be able to attack that and through skiing is you know, it's a story that I just want to learn more about. It's one of those stories. So I thank you for coming and for presenting this very interesting information to us. Thanks for watching.
You're welcome.